We're taking the research and putting it into practice to teach sight words. I'm Carrie Woodward, and I'm a Board Certified Behavior Analyst, and this is the CEU Learning Lab. If you're here just to learn a little bit more about what the research says in teaching sight words, awesome, welcome. If you're interested in getting continuing education units as a BCBA, we're going to want to pay attention to the keywords that I give throughout the presentation. You're going to need these keywords at the end in order to come back to our website and get CEU credits towards your certification. I will announce every one. We will put them on the screen, write them down. You probably will forget. Please don't just try to remember them. Give yourself some sort of prompt in order to recall these words at the end of the presentation. We are going to be jumping into a journal article from the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. It is entitled, "The Effect of Stimulus Disparity on Acquisition of Sight Word Sets, Manipulation of the Initial Letter." The authors are Jensen Chodo, Erica D. Lozzi, Rachel Marin, and Jean M. Donaldson. And it looks like this article was produced based on the first author's master's thesis. We're going to jump right into the introduction. In the introduction, the authors specifically talk about the importance of learning how to read and how all of the long-term outcomes for people who don't learn how to read end up being worse than the long-term outcomes of people who learn how to read fluently. I think we can all probably agree to the importance of reading. But even just at a young age, not being on par with reading can end to people who drop out of school or have behavioral or emotional problems later in life. I recently did another video on utilizing stimulus equivalence procedures in order to teach reading. And in that video, I specifically talk about how reading is a behavioral cusp for pretty much everybody who learns how to read. A behavioral cusp is a behavior that is so important that it opens up doors to new reinforcers. It opens up new environments. It acts as a replacement behavior for maladaptive behavior. And I think reading is such a huge example of a behavioral cusp. So of course, we as practitioners want to do everything that we can in order to give our clients fluent reading repertoires. The study then goes on to discuss the two different types of reading that exist for us. And if you've ever worked in a classroom with young kids, you will immediately understand the differences in these two different types of reading. First, you have phonetic reading, and this is teaching clients how to sound out words. What are all of the sounds in the alphabet? What are the sounds that make up the basic phonemes of the language that you're speaking or reading? How do you put these together and sound out a word that you've never seen before? And this type of reading is incredibly important because if we talk about two different repertoires, one that is finite, meaning that there's only a certain number of responses in that response class, and one that is infinite, meaning there are innumerable responses within the response class, reading is a pretty infinite response class. You couldn't teach every single unique word to a student. But if you teach them how to learn, if you teach them how to decode or sound out words, they can come up against a word they've never seen before, they can sound it out, and they can say that word pretty spot on. The second type of reading is called sight word reading. And these are words that are high-frequency words that happen often in reading, but that they don't necessarily follow the same rules as phonetic reading. Some of them do, but a lot of them don't. So if you think about the word the, T-H-E, that's not exactly how you would sound out that word just in phonetic reading. Or the word know, K-N-O-W. You wouldn't sound out the K sound with the N. So these are words that we just have to teach kids how to memorize. When you see these letters together, this is the word that it is. In early phonics learning instruction, words are introduced as word families. So you see words that are presented all that have the same suffix. For example, if AT is the end of the word, they teach the students by using different letters rotating in the front of that word. So you have BAT, bat, CAT, cat. These are our word families. However, when we go to sight word reading, the words are introduced based on the frequency that the child is going to experience that word in their natural reading. So if you have words that are happening all of the time in sentences frequently, those are going to be the first words that kids are starting to learn in a sight word reading instruction. However, this can be a bit problematic because it does not take into account the complexity of the word, how many stimuli are in the word itself, how difficult is this word going to be to learn alongside other words that are very similar. So the sight word reading, if you've heard of Dolch sight word list or the Fry sight word list, these are breaking up all of the sight words that kids need to learn and putting them in categories based on how frequently they're going to see these words, and you start with the most frequent. So this is going to be your A, your at, your the. But again, when you have kids who are having a bit of an issue with learning sight words, not taking into account how complex the word is or how difficult it's going to be to learn alongside different words, this can be problematic. The study authors actually note that this strategy is problematic because sight words are complex stimuli in that words are made up of multiple letters, and the arrangement of the letters within the word determines the correct response of reading the word. And I really love the explanation because it really shows us that it's not just the letters in the word, but it's the order of the letters in the word that is so important in getting our kids to read these words correctly. If you take two words that have all of the same letters in the word, but the letters are in different order, like scan, S-C-A-N, and cans, C-A-N-S, you realize how quickly it's not just letters, but letter position that's important. And so the makeup of the word, the way that the letters are existing within the word, are what needs to come to control the response of reading that word. If it's just identifying letters in random order and saying the word, we're going to be very incorrect a lot of the time. So there's something that starts to happen frequently, and if you have any experience working with children who have some level of disability in reading, you notice that at times certain aspects of the word start to control the response rather than the whole word together. So let's just say you teach your client to read the word help, and you got it. It's mastered. They read it 100% of the time when they see that word. However, the next word that you're going to introduce is the word here. And the moment that you show your client the word here, they immediately say help. So what's happening here? Well, we could guess that the letter H in the word help is actually controlling the response of saying help, such that when this client then sees letter H in the beginning of some other letters, they immediately say help because that's what's controlled their response. So it goes to show how vitally important it is as a practitioner to make sure that our clients are attending to the full word in order to be able to read correctly. Because if they read help every time they see a word that starts with H, it's going to have a problem there. Another factor that contributes to our kids' ability to learn how to read sight words easily is something that the authors refer to as stimulus disparity. And this just means how different are two stimuli from each other. When you have two words that have high stimulus disparity, this means they're two words that are very different from one another. They share few common properties. So if you take the word little and the word jump, these have a high stimulus disparity. They start with a different letter. One word has 5 letters, one word has 4 letters. When you just do a visual analysis of the letters that make up the word jump has letters that only go below the bottom line, and the word little has only letters that go above the bottom line. So there's a high stimulus disparity between these two words. When we talk about low stimulus disparity, we're talking about two words that are very similar or that share a lot of properties. So if we take the word car and the word cat, for example, they're both the same length, 3 letters. They both start with letter C, and they both also have letter A in the middle. So the only difference in these two words is at the very end of the word. So we would say these two words, car and cat, have a low stimulus disparity. And what this study is actually going to be examining is 2 different strategies to teaching sight words. One is teaching words that have a low stimulus disparity together versus teaching words that have a high stimulus disparity together, then testing to see what those words do when they're being read amongst other words. And if you have some practice in teaching kids reading, you'll know that even if you teach words that have high stimulus disparity, meaning they're very different from one another, once they've mastered those words within that context of that set, you then have to put those words with other words that are similar. So inevitably, you're going to have kids reading words that have low stimulus disparity. So which strategy is the most efficient to teach initially? How quickly can you get your kids to acquire the reading skills of words that end up having low stimulus disparity in the end? Do you start by teaching with low stimulus disparity, or do you teach with high stimulus disparity and then put them in with words that have low stimulus disparity? Okay, here's your first keyword. Again, if you're getting continuing education units toward your BCBA certification, write down this word. Your keyword is reading. This study used kids who were between the ages of 4 and 6 and who were identified as needing some help in learning sight words or were struggling a bit with sight word reading, whether that was by the teacher or by their parent. They were then administered a tool called the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills, or the DEBLS. I'm not familiar with this tool, but it examined a variety of different levels throughout reading, whether it was reading fluency, sight word recognition, phonetic reading, and it was administered by somebody who had experience using this tool. From there, they came up with a pool of 5 kids who all met the criteria by the study's authors. These 5 participants were then given a pre-assessment test, and they were given a bunch of different words so that the study authors could come up with a list of 24 words that the student could not read yet. So a baseline of 0% for these 24 words. These 24 words were then broken up into 4 different sets, and here's how these 4 sets were divided. First, you had a similar set. A similar set involved 3 sets of 3 words. So there were 9 words total within the similar set. Each set had words that started with the same letter. So set 1 was same, side, and such. Set 2 was mine, move, and many. Set 3 were, when, and want. Now, this was just an example of one participant. Each of the participants had completely different sets from each other based on how they performed in their baseline. Within the similar set, they started just with one of the 3-word set. They would teach that to mastery, and then they would introduce the second set of 3 words to mastery, and then the third set of 3 words to mastery. So this was the similar set. Each of the words within the set started with the same letter. Next, you had the dissimilar set. The dissimilar set was like the similar set in that they had 3 sets of 3 words for a total of 9 words within the set. However, the difference was that each set had 1 word that started with letter H, 1 word that started with letter L, and 1 word that started with letter C. So for example, one of the participants' dissimilar sets were high, life, and cold, help, lake, and cute, hard, left, and scent. So you can see how when all 9 words within the set are looked at together, they're pretty identical. They all have 3 words that start with 1 letter, 3 words that start with a different letter, and 3 words that start with another different letter. It's how the words are presented in the set that differs. Are they being presented amongst similar stimuli that all start with the same letter as in our similar set? Or are they being introduced with words that start with different letters like within our dissimilar set? You then have 2 control sets. The similar control set is similar to the words within the similar sets in that there were 3 words that all start with the same letter. Just 3, that's it. The dissimilar control set were going to be 3 words that all started with a different letter. So for example, one of the similar sets was both, base, and bin, and a dissimilar set was also, done, and open. These control sets were actually never used in the teaching. They never tried to teach these words, but they did test for the acquisition of these words during their mastery probes, which I'll talk about later. This was simply a test to see whether or not the clients were acquiring these words outside of the context of the study. The experimenters used an alternating treatment design, counterbalancing the different phases so that they didn't have any sort of order effects. So some days the students were introduced to a similar set first, followed by a dissimilar set, and on other days they were introduced to a dissimilar set first, followed by a similar set. Before any of the teaching sessions, they did what they called a mastery probe, and this took every single word, including the controls, and tested to see where the client was with reading those words prior to any teaching happening that day. So again, this was looking to see whether or not any of the control words were being acquired outside of the study. During this mastery probe, they would present each of the words, and if the client read the word correctly, they got access to a token and social praise. If they read the word incorrectly, the experimenter simply moved on to the next trial in the mastery probe. And then prior to beginning the actual teaching session of the day, the experimenter conducted a preference assessment. The clients were working for tokens and trading in those tokens for a backup reinforcer at the end of the session. They don't talk at all about whether or not the clients had a history with token economies, but they did all acquire words through the context of this training. And so we can probably say that tokens functioned as reinforcers for these children. And then they traded in the tokens for a backup reinforcer at the end of the session for something that was identified earlier in the preference assessment. Okay, if you're getting continuing education units, your second keyword is mastery. And here are the steps of the teaching session. So these are teaching sessions, remember, are just happening with words from the similar set and words from the dissimilar set, but neither of the control sets. They would first start by going over any of the words that were missed during the mastery probe. So the experimenter would hold up the word, would model the correct pronunciation of the word. If the student imitated the word, they would receive social praise. If they didn't imitate the word, the experimenter would give a verbal prompt and say, repeat after me, and then restate the missed word. Once this round was completed, where we were going over the missed words from the mastery probe, they then took the 3 words that were the target set, and they rotated the order of the words so that the client was receiving 9 trials. So they were going to get the set 3 different times. Then the word was presented. If the client read the word correctly, they had access to the token and social praise. And if they read the word incorrectly, the experimenter followed what they referred to as the modeling strategy outlined in the Kodak 2016 study. I always find it a bit cumbersome when you're reading an article and trying to get the meat of how to do this procedure when they refer to other articles rather than just writing out the strategy that they use, because now I have to go open up a different article, but that's fine. I did it for you. So I opened up the Kodak 2016 article and I read through what they actually called demonstration, and they didn't call it modeling. These authors call it modeling, although I couldn't find anything else in the Kodak article that referred to modeling, so I'm guessing that this is what it is. So when the client read the word incorrectly or did not read the word at all, the experimenter modeled the word. So if the word was same, they would hold it up, they would say same, but they didn't actually require the client to imitate the word and say it correctly before moving on to the next trial. The authors noted that one set was considered mastered when it was at 100% accuracy. So the student had to read every single word with 100% before advancing to the next set of 3 words. And they did this for the similar set and the dissimilar set the exact same way. Once mastery was achieved, they introduced the next 3-word set. Once mastery was achieved there, they introduced the last 3-word set. So that by the end of teaching, the student had mastered with 100% accuracy all 9 words of the set within the context of the training set that they were introduced in. Following mastery, they went into a post-test phase where they threw all of the words from the dissimilar set in together. So if you had been introduced to the dissimilar set, you had 3 words that all started with a different letter. However, once now it's in with all of 9 words from that set, you now have 3 words that start with H, 3 words that start with L, and 3 words that start with C. So if part of the control of reading was that each of the words started with a different letter, so that when you saw the H word, you knew what word it was because there was no other H word in the array, this was going to be more problematic because now you were going to have multiple words in the array that started with the same letter. So in the similar set, once all of the 9 words were put together, remember these words were actually trained with words that all started with the same letter. So the 9 also had 3 words that started with one letter, 3 words that started with another letter, and 3 words that started with a different letter than that. Once they were all grouped into 9, it wasn't very different than what they'd experienced during the actual training phase. So the experimenter's question is this: once the words were all mixed in together, was initial teaching with dissimilar words going to lead to more mastery or more maintenance of the skill? Or were words that were taught in initially with similar sets going to lead to better mastery and maintenance once they were interspersed with other words? Once this post-test was concluded, they took any of the words that were missed and they were put into what they called an interspersed teaching phase. And they did the exact same strategy in the actual teaching phase, but they just targeted the words that had been missed, and they continued doing that until the student was able to do it with 100% mastery. And so what we're looking at is basically the number of trials necessary to mastery. Maybe it took more trials if you taught it with the similar set, but perhaps they did better at the end and required fewer trials and interspersed. Vice versa, maybe they got them more quickly using the dissimilar set, but maybe they required more teaching in the interspersed teaching, such that the total number of trials required to actual mastery may have been higher. We'll see about that in the results section. Okay, your third keyword for continuing education units is teaching. So what were the results of the study? Well, all of the students started at a baseline of 0%, meaning they couldn't read any of the words at all in the sets that they were introduced to. And all of them acquired the reading of these words by the end of the study. In terms of what they did with the controls, most of them did not acquire the control words. However, some of the students did acquire some of those words. If they did demonstrate that they had acquired a control word, the experimenters actually swapped out that word and put a new control word into the set. But overall, performance on the control sets was much lower than performance in the teaching sets, meaning that the teaching strategies worked in teaching these skills. And though the results did vary from participant to participant, the general takeaways were this. It took generally fewer trials to meet mastery criterion initially, teaching in the dissimilar sets. That makes sense because they're not having to discriminate these words with other words that start with the same initial letter. So it took fewer trials to meet mastery in the dissimilar set than in the similar set. So it took more trials in the similar set in order to get mastery criteria. However, when they went into that post-test, they required far more interspersed teaching sessions in order to meet in order to learn those words from the dissimilar set than in the similar set. So it seemed like even though the initial teaching may have taken a little bit longer, they actually were able to teach more robust skills that held up when they were put in with other words, as opposed to quicker teaching, but needing a lot more teaching in that interspersed teaching when the words were with other words that had lower stimulus disparity. The other thing that the authors noted was that despite which strategy worked for each student better, they all tended to get better with each consecutive set, meaning if it took longer in the similar set number 1 took the longest, and then similar set number 2 took not quite as long, and similar set number 3 took less time than that. So they were almost learning how to learn, or if they had relied more heavily in the dissimilar set on that first letter position, by the time they got to the second set, they were the same letter. So they really had to focus on all of the letters in that word in order to engage in the correct response. Okay, and your fourth and final keyword is practice. So the whole point of these CEU presentations, or if you're not getting CEUs, the presentations in general, is to be able to take stuff that's being published in our journals, in our field, and actually break it down and utilize it in your practice, because that's what the research is there for. As a practicing clinician, I found it very hard to keep up with all of the literature that was coming out because we're so busy with our practice. So what I'm hoping to do is be able to go through this literature, find ones that I think are going to be relevant for you who are out in the field, and break it down, and then also offer some of the insight that I have from 20 years of practice in utilizing some of these strategies. So this article, what it gives us is a teaching strategy. You're doing nothing with the manipulation of the actual stimuli themselves. You're just pairing stimuli together in one way or the other, either with other stimuli with which they have low stimulus disparity or stimuli with which they have higher stimulus disparity. The thing that I think that is so important to remember is that results of single case research are always hugely beneficial, but you'll often find that participants within the study had different results, and that's because every single learner comes with a unique learning history. They have a past that they have experience or exposure with textual stimuli, or they have experience and exposure with certain types of prompts. So what works for one student beautifully may not necessarily be the most efficient method of teaching a different student. So though it's so important to read the research and understand the research, your job then as a practitioner is to be able to identify where your students' skills and weaknesses are, and how are you going to tailor a strategy to benefit them so that you can be the most efficient in your teaching. We don't have all of the time in the world to teach our kids. They may not have a funded ABA program forever. And so how can we be the most efficient? How can we get them the skills more quickly than a different strategy? So our job is not just to teach a skill, but it's to teach a skill in the most efficient way that we can for that individual client. I think another important thing to understand about this specific article was that the participants were neurotypical. They were not in special education classes, and they were not identified as having any sort of developmental disability. And practitioners that are in the applied behavior analysis world are often working with students that have some sort of neurodiversity or developmental disability. So what the results say about reading, it should be taken with a grain of salt that this was a neurotypical population. How are the results going to generalize to a population that may have some other needs? In my clinical practice, I have found that it is usually the most beneficial to begin with a solid foundation and then build on it from there. And so when you have a kid who is struggling with sight word acquisition because the stimulus control is often being exerted by the first letter in the word, it means that we maybe had some stuff that we could have done before introducing sight words to get our kids to attend to all of the stimuli being presented. So when you're first starting out, instead of jumping right into sight words and just seeing if your kids can acquire it, build up in complexity by giving them increasingly more complex skills so that when you introduce sight words, you have kids that are attending to the full word because basically you've taught how to attend to all of the stimuli being presented. So I would start with identical line matching. We're talking a straight line to a straight line, whether it's horizontal or vertical, a diagonal line to a diagonal line in the same direction. So we're basically being able to discriminate lines on a paper because that's what letters are. They're just black lines on a paper. And so if your kid has not been exposed to lines on a paper and understanding how they match with point-to-point correspondence to other stimuli in a field, when you get to a letter or a word, it's a bunch of lines on paper. So it means even less. So start with the single line matching. Then build your own characters, not letters yet, but build your own characters using two different lines, whether that's one straight horizontal line and one straight vertical line. Put it in different directions, put it facing a different way so that the visual discrimination that your client is having to engage in is very specific and very precise. It assures that they are really attending to the stimuli and that their matching response is completely controlled by the full picture. It's not just one of the lines because you have multiple other stimuli that are out and visible that have a similar line. Once you're able to do that, then work on letter matching. If you're struggling, if the kids are struggling, start by having your array be one letter that is your target letter and then two letters that are very different so that the visual discrimination is not quite as hard. So if you're starting with capital letter A, put it in an array with lowercase p and s. Those are two letters that are very different. They have curved lines. One is shorter, one is longer. Capital A, on the other hand, has very sharp angles and only straight lines. Once that discrimination is there, then start to throw in your target letter with other letters that share common properties. Because again, when we're talking about low stimulus disparity, we're talking about things that share common properties, and that makes a discrimination much more difficult. So get it first with the high stimulus disparity, then move to low stimulus disparity if you're struggling. If your kids are getting the discrimination part pretty well, then jump right into the low stimulus disparity. Do it because that's a more complex skill. Once your student is doing that letter-to-letter matching, then you can go into doing single word matching. Start with like simple words, whether they're two letters or even CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant words. Because do the matching part before you work in sight word reading, because this is going to assure that they're actually paying attention to all of the words. Do word to word matching where other words in the array have low stimulus disparity. So if you're working on word matching for the word sat, put say in the mix as well, because this assures that they are attending to the full word. So that when you jump to the sight word reading, it doesn't really matter. You can teach it in whatever way is easier. You can most likely start teaching it with the low stimulus disparity because you've already worked on teaching your student to attend to all of the stimuli within the word. So often as a practitioner, you don't get a kid that you get to start from the beginning with. You get kids who come with this very complex learning history, maybe even a learning history that's a bit wonky because of the way that other practitioners or teachers were teaching the student before you got your hands on them. So you don't always get to start from the bottom and work your way up, although that would be the most ideal way to do it. So there are some other things that have benefited my practice that I found very helpful in starting to try to work on acquiring stimulus control with the whole word as opposed to that first letter. What this research that we talked about today specifically talks about is the way that we teach them, or the organization of the way the words are presented to the student in order for learning. What I'm going to talk about is ways that we can actually move to manipulate the stimulus and move to transfer control away from the first letter in the word and to the rest of the word, so that the full word is controlling the reading response. One way to go about doing that is to work and manipulate the size of the letters. So if you have the word same, then you would make the S very, very small and you would make the AME much bigger. You could introduce that with other words that start with the letter S while you make the S much smaller so that that's not the stimulus that's being attended to. Once they're discriminating and reading the word without the letter S huge, then you can gradually increase the size of the letter S until it's the same size as the rest of the words. And hopefully what you've done is you have maintained the control of reading that word with all of the letters rather than it being exerted back over with just the letter S at the beginning of the word. Another thing that you could do to play around with getting stimulus control within the whole word is to play with the transparency of that first letter. So instead of playing with the size, now we're playing with the transparency. So you keep the letter the exact same size. So if you're working on the letter or the word same, you take that letter S, it's the same size as all of the other letters, but we're going to make it 90% transparent, so it's barely visible. It's there, but it's barely visible. You work to acquire the reading response, and then you gradually increase the opacity of that S until it is the same color and transparency as the rest of the word. So again, what you're doing is you're hoping to establish stimulus control with the other letters in the word, and you're then gradually building that S back in to become part of a whole rather than a single piece that's separate from the rest of the word. And as is the case with the study, when I have used these two strategies with students, We see that learning happens over time such that it becomes more efficient with each consecutive set that we introduce. So though it may take 100 trials during your first set, each set that you introduce requires fewer and fewer trials. And so it actually becomes a more efficient strategy in the long run because they're learning how to learn and it's getting easier for them. A third way that I approached sight word reading is actually very different. The first two are playing within stimulus prompts. The control of the reading is still with the visual stimulus. We're just manipulating which visual stimuli are controlling the response and then gradually working to transfer stimulus control over to the full word. This other way actually plays around with where the control of the reading response lies. And I don't know that it was the most efficient. I'm going to tell you the full story, but again, when you have clients that have complicated learning histories, sometimes you have to play around with a lot and look outside of where research is to find something that's going to work for that unique client. If you have been a behavior analyst that is working in school settings and have been a part of an IEP team, you will probably appreciate this story. But I did a lot of work working with IEP teams, and what I found was that you get a lot more bees with honey than you do with vinegar. I think behavior analysts can be a little cocky sometimes. We can be very know-it-all, and we can be pretty dismissive of other fields and the expertise that they're bringing. And though sometimes I felt in my heart that I knew the better way to approach something, I wasn't going to get anywhere if I didn't get buy-in from the rest of the IEP team. So here's my suggestion. If you're a behavior analyst and you're working on IEP teams, be open to collaboration. Be open to utilizing strategies that other professionals are bringing. Give it a shot. It's so much better to give it a shot and then it not work and you say, hey, we gave it a shot, we looked at the data, this strategy didn't work, than to shoot it down outright and not even allow, because that just closes the door to future collaboration. So be open to collaboration. If you've been on an IEP team, you probably also know that the way that special academic instruction works is that the goals are generated based on curriculum level and not based on our kids' mastery. As behavior analysts, we move on to the next more complex skill when the previous skill has been mastered, because we understand that unless the foundational prerequisites exist, you can only build your house so big before all of the sticks start to crumble. So when you have a teacher sitting in an IEP that says, oh, you're still struggling with reading letters, that goal wasn't met, but hey, our next goal is reading words. You know, as a behavior analyst, like, this is not the way that we need to approach it. But again, be open to collaboration, be open to working with a teacher and coming up with a strategy that's going to benefit the student, because in the long run, your student benefits if they can learn the skill in whatever way it happens. So in my example, I had a client that was struggling with reading, and reading and letter recognition had always been difficult. And actually the stimulus equivalence video that I did was referring to this one client, and we used stimulus equivalence procedures in order to do a picture to word matching to give this student reading, because over time we could fade pictures and the student could read the word. But this teaching strategy only worked for words for which there was a relevant picture associated with it. So if you're working on the word tree, you can find a picture of a tree and you could do a picture to word matching procedure where you can fade out that picture of a tree and your student could read the word tree. But when we get to these sight words very rarely have a picture. It's not a noun. At, the, like, just. These aren't words that we can come up with a picture that our students could easily tact. So you have to come up with different strategies. And this student was really struggling with sight words. If you've ever been in one of these specialized academic instruction classrooms, a lot of these teachers have fabulous strategies, and we could learn to incorporate some of these strategies. So they were doing sight words, and they would introduce a new word or few words in a week, and they would do this thing where they tapped out the letters on their arm, and they used this swooping motion to say the word. So they would say T-H-E, the. And I watched this student that we worked with that was really struggling on sight words, and he was participating with the rest of the class, tapping out those letters and saying the word. Now, that's an intraverbal. The stimulus control does not live in the actual written textual word. It lives in the verbal stimulus of T-H-E. but it was working for him. And I was thinking, if we could get him to engage in this intraverbal response, could it evoke his own could his own intraverbal evoke his own reading of the word when he sees that word? Yes, you have to have letter tacting, because when you see the word the, you need to be able to say THE the. And it worked. We were able to teach him like 50 sight words by having him say the letters and then say the word. And it really was an interverbal. Yes, he saw the visual, he needed the visual in order to say the letter sounds, but it truly was an interverbal. In the absence of that word and seeing that word, if you said to him THE, he would say the. So there was a very, very strong interverbal control here. The problem, the thing that you don't really think about sometimes, is that as behavior analysts, we can teach anything. But how do we get the behaviors to start occurring under natural stimulus conditions? How do these behaviors fare up over time when they have kind of weird stimulus control? And that's what we had done, is we had given the student this repertoire of reading, but it existed under weird stimulus conditions. So when he was reading a sentence, he would be reading and he would say THE the. He was saying it all out loud overtly. And the teacher and I, in the beginning, we worked on this, we collaborated, and we did so well. And she was so excited that we were able to give him this repertoire that had been absent and that was so tricky for him. And at some point she was like, we really need to talk about this because it's affecting his fluency. And that's not something we think we're talking about when we're talking about the teaching of sight words. When we're talking about teaching words specifically, fluency comes into play down the line. How long is it going to take this kid to read a sentence or a paragraph if they're tacting every letter and then using that interverbal control to say the word? And so I was like, you're right. When you watch him read, he's doing THE the bird, because the bird was a word that we had taught using picture word matching. WENT went, and I was like, you're going to lose the coherence of the sentence by the end because it's taken so long to get through it. And so we ended up having to do some differential reinforcement, because what we know about organisms is that we will engage in the lowest effort response that acts as a reinforcer, right? So more effortful responses will die off if a lower effort response is getting reinforced. Well, sounding out the letters to himself is a higher effort response than just saying the word. And if we could get that to transfer from an overt out loud thing to happen covertly and happen more quickly, then we could say, hey, we gave this kid some reading skills that are actually benefiting him in the natural environment and under natural stimulus conditions. And so we ended up taking all of the words that we had taught him using this interverbal sounding it out strategy, and we simply put on extinction anytime he overtly sounded out the word. So he would say THE the, and we would keep holding it up, THE the. And that moment that he said the in the absence of spelling it out, we provided the reinforcement. And what we saw was that we could actually get these words to start happening without needing to sound them out. So was it the most efficient strategy? Maybe not, but for this unique client with his complex learning history, this was the one strategy that worked for him. So what I want to talk about now is future research, because there's so many areas of future research that could be explored just with the idea of reading. And with our population of students that we work with, a lot of times behavior analysts are looked at on the IEP team as there for behavior. If you're a behavior analyst, you understand that pretty much everything that we do all day, every day is behavior. So reading is behavior. If you've read Skinner's verbal behavior, textual behavior is a behavior that we talk about. But a lot of people don't look at behavior analysts as people who are reading teachers. They look at teachers as people who are reading teachers. So we could really do some amazing research to come up with what are the most efficient teaching strategies for reading. I would love to look at how the differences in efficiency in, not just similar and dissimilar sets, which these article authors have done so beautifully, but using within stimulus prompting strategies, looking at that interverbal, what history does a student have to come to you with? What prerequisite skills do they have to have? What's our participant makeup that makes one strategy more beneficial than the other? Because then that would make our practitioner job so much easier to say, This is the client profile that better benefits from us within stimulus prompting by making the letter smaller and gradually making it bigger, or teaching it in a dissimilar set first and then moving into interspersed teaching. Or the interverbal strategy is more beneficial for a student that comes to you with this profile based on their learning history. Our job would be cut down. We wouldn't have to do the work to actually test out these different procedures and test for efficiency with each client. So if you're a master's student looking for a thesis idea, I think this would be so great. When I was getting my master's degree and looking at where I wanted to do my thesis research, my graduate advisor, who is this brilliant behavior analyst by the name of Hank Schlinger, I wanted to save the world with my master's thesis. I came up with an idea that was this has never been studied before. This is so amazing. And he was like, okay, well, you can save the world later. Just do it quick and do it dirty. Do a replication study of an article that you find fascinating and that you know that you're going to have access to participants who will meet a similar profile. And I was like, okay. But so this is the replication study. Do a replication of this research and play around with the ways that the words are presented to your participants. If you're not a master's student, if you're already a BCBA and you have participants that you're doing work with, I think it can be so hard to build research into applied work. When you have people who are doing research and they have this beautiful lab and they come to you with this research, that can be very discouraging as a clinician who's in the nitty-gritty field, working in clients' homes, working in clients' schools, where you have a really hard time controlling variables. But you could very easily do multiple baseline studies across participants using this procedure and looking to see which ones benefit your students more. So don't be scared about actually trying to build in some research opportunities to your applied work. It's actually easier than you think if you can just sit down and figure out what single case research design is going to work for you, and then make sure, obviously, that your RBTs that are on your team are well trained in their data collection. So lots of areas for research. I think the field of reading is not only important for us as behavior analysts with a population of kids who are developmentally disabled, but also in being able to give reading technology to actual academic teachers. That's more beneficial than what the current strategies and curriculum would tell them is the best way to approach it. So think about ways that you can build in different strategies, utilize these strategies in your applied work. Let us know if you found any of this helpful, and if you found anything that's worked for your students. That would really be awesome. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Research to Practice. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something.